Hello, I'm David Hunt, CEO and founder of Hyperion Executive Search and your host for the Leaders in Cleantech podcast, the last podcast of the year. So thanks very much for all of your feedback and all of your listens and downloads over the course of this year. I hope it's been useful and productive. Thanks also for all of you who've given feedback on the new video format today. Due to British bad weather and technical issues, we're back in a slightly older-fashioned format of video, which you'll see, but hopefully no less impact on great content and a great conversation. Next year, of course, we're back in the studio. But super excited about today, actually, which is a great one for year-end, looking at the clean tech investment and policy situation over the course of 2022, and importantly, looking at what the scenario, what the landscape looks like for 2023. With a guest we've had on previously, actually, just over a year ago, which is Jules Besnainou, who's Executive Director at Cleantech for Europe, who's very much inside what's going on here, very much hooked into the VC community and the policy landscape. So there's lots of learnings from this and lots of really good conversations that we'll dig into, which hopefully will be useful and a very productive end of year for you. Of course, we'll be sort of not recording over the Christmas period, but you can dig into, I think, about 105 episodes now if you are so inclined to get away from the turkey and the family to go and listen to an episode or two. Otherwise, of course, we'll see you in the new year. But for now, I'm going to introduce you to Jules. We're going to have a great conversation around clean tech in Europe. Hey, Jules, it's great to have you with us again.
Thanks for having me, David. Nice to be back.
Super and exciting and a good time to have you back because there's a lot that's happened this year in obviously both the policy and the investment landscape across Europe, and lots to look forward to next year. Lots of references for our US guests in terms of some of the good things that are going on in the US and how we're, I guess, looking to counter and work alongside that within the European clean tech community. So, but perhaps for those who aren't familiar, you can give us a quick update on yourself and on just exactly who are Cleantech for Europe, who's involved, and what's your mission?
Sure. So Cleantech for Europe, our mission is to bridge the gap between cleantech and policymakers. So we operate in Brussels and in a number of member states across Europe to make sure that the cleantech community gets access to and has regular contact with policymakers. We support a number of different coalitions, one of venture capital firms, investors in cleantech. More than 20 of those are part of Cleantech for Europe. More recently, we launched a coalition of scale-ups with 8 of the fastest growing cleantech companies in Europe, and with the support of Bill Gates and of Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson. And a few months ago as well, we supported the launch of the first Cleantech Group for policymakers, supporting a number of members of the European Parliament put together their own friendship group around the topic of cleantech. And just for bearings, Cleantech for Europe was initiated by Cleantech Group, who I'm sure a lot of your listeners are aware of, and is supported by Breakthrough Energy, the climate organization founded by Bill Gates.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And again, most people will be familiar with and maybe even attended some of the Cleantech Group forums around the world. They're certainly always great to get together with. So let's touch a little bit since our last conversation, which was last October, by the way. And it feels like a million years ago. But what have been some of the key, I guess, achievements or successes during 2022 for Cleantech for Europe and within the European cleantech community?
Right. So when we last spoke, we were kind of a new kid on the block, trying to set up this initiative. I think at the time there was, very little contact, honestly, between the cleantech community and the policy community. I think our biggest win, I would say, over the last year has been that this has changed in a significant way. That the cleantech community in Europe is now much more plugged in to what's happening in Brussels and in member states. And that we have real kind of routes for providing feedback on what the cleantech ecosystem needs to scale up, right? So if I take the example of our group of investors, of our investor coalition, they've had a chance throughout the year to provide significant input into a number of policy topics for the EU, be that around sustainable finance, be that around carbon pricing, around funding instruments for clean tech. And that input has been taken on board by a number of policymakers. So that I'd say that's the kind of biggest achievement for the past year. And maybe as a consequence of that, what you're seeing in the last few weeks is actually because of the energy security context or the energy crisis context, because of competition from the US and further out, the EU is really starting to adopt this idea that clean tech is a strategic priority. And I think that's, again, an achievement that we can build on to make sure that the strategies that come out of that are really beneficial for the clean tech ecosystem.
Yeah, I guess it's, again, one of those things that there's always a kind of perfect storm of situations which clearly aren't great. The situation in Ukraine is clearly terrible, and inflation and other things that are going on. But just on if there is an upside, it's that there are some silver linings, that there is now an attention on the energy situation in Europe, in particular, obviously the energy security, and with that leans towards renewables and the clean technologies that support decentralized energy. So there's a lot of, I guess, a perfect storm to some extent. Going back to your point, Jules, on access to policymakers, I've always said, I've been in this sector since 2007. I've always said that a lot of our success was despite government rather than because of. But as we start to scale, clearly we really do need the policy instruments to be in favor for rapid transition, which clearly we need to get to 2030, 2050. It must be a real blessing for those of you who founded the organization to have the ear, or a positive ear, from policymakers.
Well, maybe first let me come back on your idea of a perfect storm for clean tech. I think it has to do with the reality that clean technologies can enable really a new economy that has plenty of different benefits, right? We're not just talking about decarbonization. We're also talking about energy security. We're also talking about jobs, right? Industrial leadership and the kind of the economical benefits that creates. So it's almost, we're now benefiting from the fact that clean tech is not just a decarbonization play, but also a societal change in a way, and the route for a new economy. And so whenever something happens, like the energy crisis, which is absolutely terrible right now, well, people tend to turn to that to say, oh, wow, this thing we've been investing in also helps us with energy security. That's kind of what's helping us at the moment. That being said, and to your second question on success despite government, this is a real risk, right? If you look at what happened with solar in the early 2000s, policy that could not really keep up, but at the same time, policy that was kind of overly generous, then kind of self-corrected, then that kind of flip-flopping hurt the solar industry tremendously. And the result is that now there is no solar manufacturing capacity in Europe, or there is very little. So I think clean tech pioneers are definitely a bit scarred by these types of experiences and have been in the same mindset of, okay, we'll just put policy aside and succeed despite it. The reality is that now we can't really do without it. Step change in a total kind of difference of scale, right? That if you don't compete with, you're going to be left in the dust. And so there's also the transitioning of entire industries that in Europe would be very, very hard to do without good policy, right? Otherwise, you're going to have massive layoffs, you're going to have stranded assets, and investing super early into the innovation, not necessarily just the research, but also the scale up, but do it in time for the benefits to be reaped by 2030, for instance.
Yeah. Do you think that the European governments and the EU community as a whole from Brussels are recognizing your point, actually, that the solar boom was phenomenal, had its issues, like I say, the corrections, we all rode the solar coaster, but what ended up happening is clearly you have 4 or 5 key players that are all pretty much Chinese, or certainly not outside of Europe in terms of manufacture. Do you think they're recognizing, actually, with particularly the mobility transition and batteries and obviously the massive need for scaling of gigafactories has really focused them on it? It's not just, as you say, around clean energy, it's actually around jobs, it's around preservation of tax economies, all these kinds of things, which are actually almost the clean energy aspect or the decarbonization is a side effect to some extent from what can be achieved from a government and from a sort of an economic point of view.
Yeah, and the batteries example is a really, really good one, right? It's a case where the EU actually did the right thing, right? It identified a risk of losing a big part of the automotive supply chain, but it also identified an opportunity that, okay, if we start building these in Europe, then we're going to reap all those kind of side benefits, right? So we've shown that the model works, that we can do it. I think, players like Northvolt, like Vercors in France and others are, proof in the pudding that when you associate really great teams with capital, with political support, then you build champions of tomorrow, right? The difficulty is now we need to replicate that in green steel, in green cement. We need to replicate that in electric trucks. We need to replicate that in battery recycling. There are tens and tens of topics. Long duration energy storage. There's so many topics where we need to have a similar kind of growth and champion strategy, and that's where it gets a bit harder. Is batteries were kind of green field, right? Here you're going to talk about replacing existing assets, replacing existing employment pools, and all of a sudden that gets much more difficult politically to make happen, right? So we need to find the solution for these new entrants to succeed. Otherwise, they're going to be disrupted from the outside, and green steel is going to come from the US or from somewhere else.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think going back to one of those points I mentioned before, and again about it's easy in these disruptive instances to say things like, again, success has been despite not because of governments, but I do generally and have always felt sorry for policymakers because the industry and the technology just move so fast, right? So it's tough on us for those of us who live it every day to really see what's going on with hydrogen, with long duration storage, as you mentioned, with batteries, with all that's going on. So I've always felt a sympathy for policymakers because by definition governments move quite slowly, and their roles are complex and not just about clean energy, of course. So it's tough for them to know what's going on in the world and to react accordingly. So going back to your point of the within Brussels, the policymakers themselves created this friendship group. It just shows, I guess, that there's at least an appetite to get more in tune with what's going on in the marketplace, which again plays very well to your strengths and the community strengths as a whole.
Yeah, that's an extremely positive signal from the past year, to be honest. And not just with the members of European Parliament. I think we've experienced the same level of openness at the European Commission and within ministries in different countries. There's a real desire from the policy community to better understand what cleantech is about and to better understand the barriers to scale so that they can remove them. That's, again, like it's been the vast majority of interactions on our side with policymakers have been extremely positive and extremely open. Then, as you say, the challenge is more about, okay, how do you, I guess, how do you come in with the right information and the right degree of granularity for the right topics? Because, as you say, even you and I, who are kind of very deep into this industry, sometimes struggle to keep track of everything, right? It's such a vast theme that it's really hard to keep a track of everything. So the way we've approached this is, as much as possible, we try to give them very concrete cases. So whenever we have a call with a policymaker, we always try to bring a cleantech investor or a cleantech scale-up so that they can hear from their on-the-ground experience. We organize a lot of site visits, as an example. And typically when you experience that, when you meet whatever, the CEO of a scale-up, or when you visit an electrolyzer factory, it stays with you, right? And the challenges that are met on the ground stay with you, right? So that's a much more powerful experience than just sending a one-pager on a topic. Of course, we do send a lot of one-pagers on topics, but the more you kind of you bring them closer to the experience, the better the collaboration is. And I will say it's the same for the other side. When cleantech companies and cleantech investors come to the parliament or come to the commission or to ministries, they also get an understanding of the complexity that's on that side. Because also from the outside, we have a tendency to say, why isn't X and Y happening, right? And so by engaging, on both sides, you get to a level of complexity and understanding that is, where you actually make real progress.
Yeah, of understanding rather than animosity. And again, is that not animosity as such, but like so the lack of understanding of why the policymakers take so long, and obviously on the flip side of policymakers, why you tell us one thing and 6 months later it's different, and that's just how the technology is. So it's good that there's that level of understanding. We're going to look a little bit at the broader global picture, but when we spoke last, it was just at the time you were talking about Fit for 55. Can you share a little bit of some of those policy instruments or evolutions that took place this year?
Right. So if you look at the big policy projects taking place in Europe right now, one of them is definitely Fit for 55. So this is a package of different regulations that was announced now a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, that was basically, its aim was to operationalize the Green Deal, or this idea that we're going to reduce our emissions significantly by 2030 and to net zero by 2050. So Fit for 55 means getting fit for a reduction of 55% of carbon emissions by 2030. And within that, you had, I think, 12 different pieces of legislation that were reviewed to get to that goal, right? So within that, you have carbon pricing, you have energy efficiency directive, renewable energy directive, and a number of other policy files. I think the status on that is, it's mostly, the negotiation on that is mostly done. It's taken three years, I think, total to get it done, but that's the European rhythm. But now that it is, I think we're starting to see some real areas of progress. So, for instance, there is now an agreement to phase out internal combustion engines by 2035, which is a huge and an important target. There's increasing certainty on a strong carbon price by, say, 2028, which is also very good. And you're starting to see more and more signals, like having energy efficiency targets be binding at the national level. So little by little, on every sector, you're starting to see some real progress, and that's Fit for 55. But since then, there's been the war in Ukraine and the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's prompted a couple of other things on the kind of negotiation docket. One is Repower EU, which is the EU's big plan for reducing energy dependency on fossil fuels and imported fossil fuels. That's a very important package that's also being negotiated right now. That there was a preliminary agreement yesterday. And that's also very important for Cleantech. And then the third is something that's getting shaped right now, which is, how is the EU going to respond to the Inflation Reduction Act? Maybe with a sovereignty fund, maybe with other tools, maybe with reform to permitting, but yeah, these types of ideas.
Yeah, which is great, because there are some complexities around state aid rules and competition within the European community, obviously, which need to be worked around. But the Inflation Reduction Act, which is great, obviously, from a global perspective, and great for the US, but also great for Europe in actually having that stimulus, or that something to compete with, or something to work alongside. And of course, there's still continually the pressures from China in terms of their dominance in many areas of the clean tech sector, and again, particularly around batteries, of course, and vehicles, and around solar, many areas. So there's a lot of, like you say, a perfect storm of challenges, I guess. But with every challenge comes an opportunity, right? And it sounds like at last the policymakers are seeing this as an opportunity on a number of scales, that's already sort of touched on, which is refreshing. Any other key elements? Because again, we had in 2021, Jules, a really bumper investment year for clean tech in Europe, and H1 of this year obviously was I think on a similar track, and obviously the second half of the year with what's going on, it's eased off a little bit, but still, actually, it's been a good year overall for investment in European clean tech, right?
Yes. So the preliminary numbers that we're looking at show that we will likely be just a bit shy of the records of last year. So if I look at 2021, there were about 12 billion euros invested in EU cleantech. That's venture capital only, so from seed to growth equity. And from everything we're looking at right now, likely we will end up, a bit shy of that. So it won't be another record year, and it certainly won't stay on the growth path that we were on for the last few years, right? We doubled from 2020 to 2021. So there's no way we're going to double this year. So in a way, you could see that as a slowdown. In another way, you could see that as the second highest year on record for Europe. Here it is for you, half full or half empty, your choice. But I think the way we look at this is, in 2021, you had the highest ever year for venture capital in Europe, but at the same time, the scale at which cleantech was deployed was still extremely small. So if you look at, hydrogen, for instance, the mix of green hydrogen in total hydrogen used in Europe was 4% in 2021, and we need to get to 75% by 2030, according to the latest EU proposals. So that's just to say, even with huge venture capital amounts, we're still at an order of magnitude away from where we need to be in terms of scale. right? And in terms of final investment decisions. So that's just to say the clean tech venture capital firms in the space have been pioneers. Really, they've been able to take this sector in Europe from nothing to a state where we have most of the technologies we need to decarbonize and to reach energy security. But now there needs to be another step change, which is, okay, how do we get to the type of scale of capital that we need to have these solutions, really widely deployed, right? Not just at the venture capital level, but how do we get project finance? How do we get project guarantees? How do we get loans? How do we get, all the apparatus you need to really scale these technologies?
Yeah, and those are increasingly complex challenges, and obviously necessary as we start to scale and look at really infrastructure size changes within Europe. Because it's always interesting. I mean, we at Hyperion work primarily with VCs and with companies at sort of ABC rounds, so relatively early in the journey. And there's been a lot of really good investment in clean tech, obviously in the last few years from that kind of level. A lot of disruptive, a lot of great companies, a few unicorns, obviously coming from that as well. But where are the challenges? Are we finding or seeing the big sums of money, the growth capital and the sort of the real infrastructure money following through?
From our discussions with the kind of scale-up ecosystem and the scale-up coalition that we've built with companies like H2 Green Steel and Sunfire and EcoSam, Voltatrucks and a few others, we see four key challenges. One is definitely around finance, because again, you need to take it from that kind of Series C growth equity to, really hundreds of millions of euros that need to go into scale up for each of these companies, right? And you don't really have the funders in Europe that are ready to do that, because there's a real gap between the growth equity stage and the kind of the project finance stage. You need to have first of a kind deployments. You need to have significant balance sheets if you want to do these first big projects. So there's really a gap there, and I think one of the ideas we're pursuing right now is, could public finance step in for some of these projects and act as a bit of a pioneer, a bit of a risk taker, to really bridge that from 1, 2 to 5, 7 projects live. So that's one area. The second area is on demand. How do you really catalyze the demand for these technologies? And there, in some cases, for instance, the latent demand is there, right? So in hydrogen, for instance, there's huge demand for green hydrogen. That being said, that demand can't really be met right now because of additionality rules and because of lack of renewables on the grid, right? So how do you enable the demand to be realized in a way is really important. Third is around all the regulatory barriers that these scale-ups are facing. So think about permitting, think about siting, approval processes, standards. There's so many things that need to be worked on in each individual sector. And finally, there's still a real lack of infrastructure in Europe to enable that scale up, right? So how do you build the charging infrastructure? How do you build the hydrogen transport infrastructure? How do you build the renewables and the grid infrastructure? So until we have all of these pieces, the real scale up will really struggle to take off.
It is all about scale now, as you say. I think we all know that all the technologies kind of exist in one shape or form or another. Of course, they will evolve, but we have all of the tools primarily, but it is around the scale and the challenges that faces. I was intrigued actually because, again, you had the Bill Gates Breakthrough Energy Foundation joining you or becoming involved. And they have been quite game changing, I think, because, again, they've worked with or supporting a number of our clients in the US where they're dropping huge ticket sizes. But A, obviously the name of Bill Gates, and B, the size of money that they have, hopefully is showing that the situation is ripe for these kinds of major investments, because there's always risk, and the government's always wary of risk of white elephant projects that come to nothing, and there've always been plenty of those certainly in the UK and across Europe as well. But that kind of involvement from figureheads like that who are bringing substantial money to as well as expertise, I think has to be a good thing for Europe.
Of course, they're incredibly important partners to this initiative. We couldn't have done it without them. I think the reality is that they've really understood that, one, you need a systemic change. If you want these clean technologies to rise, you need obviously to support the innovation stage, but you also need to support the scale up. You need to understand what supportive policy for clean tech means, and so they've really taken up a holistic approach and worked alongside the value chain to facilitate at each step. I think the second thing they've understood is just the power of the network, right? And they've been it's been really important to them to mobilize the entire Cleantech network. So, for instance, in Europe, we've worked with Cleantech Scandinavia in the Nordics, with Cleantech Estonia in the Baltics, and this ability to bring everyone around the table and to mobilize the whole ecosystem is also extremely important.
No, definitely. So let's look at, it's been a good year in 2022 with some key policy changes. I think what's really pleasing for many of us who watch things like the COP and COP27 recently, where it's kind of fairly deflating. But then you look this year at the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the impact that's had. You look at some of the good stuff that we just talked about in Europe and the responses to that. So and again, as we said, a sort of a bumper second record year ever in terms of investment. So there's so many good things going on or have happened this year. We still have the backdrop, of course, to the energy crisis and the war in Ukraine. We still have the backdrop to high inflationary pressures. But how do you see the landscape in 2023 from both an investment perspective and also from a continuation of these policy discussions?
Yeah, so I mean, if we're to take a bit of a darker stance, we've only seen the start of the energy crisis. It's now getting really cold in Europe, and it remains to be seen whether we have what it takes to get through this winter. Not even mentioning the next one. Yeah. So I think we should all be prepared for a difficult few months ahead. Obviously, nothing compared with what our friends in Ukraine are going through, but we're all going to be somewhat feeling some of the effects of that. And I think it's really important to also have a look at what that means for European industry and what reactions that may create on the political front, right? So that's one thing to really look out for and be attentive to. The other is not underestimating the reaction that the Inflation Reduction Act is causing in Europe, right? And I think to some extent, so we need, first off, let's applaud the Inflation Reduction Act. It was something that we've been waiting for on the US side for years, and kudos to them for getting it passed. That being said, it creates a number of big problems for the EU because it's on a level of ambition and also simplicity that is going to be really, really hard for us to match. Even if we end up matching the numbers, which is going to be challenging, we are still facing in Europe a system that is quite complicated to operate for newcomers and for startups and scale-ups. If you look at how to apply for EU funding, for instance, it's incredibly complicated in Europe, whereas in the US, the DOE gives you a call and says, hey, we have this interesting pot of money. Seems like you're doing good stuff. Do you want to put in an application, right? And so there's a whole change of mindset that needs to happen in Europe if we want to compete with something like that. So overall, how we look at 2023 is, okay, Cleantech is now a strategic priority for the EU, and that's great. But now we need to help the EU build its Cleantech strategy while delivering on it, because we don't have much time. And so, again, how do you mobilize the right funding with simplicity? How do you create the demand? How do you work on the remaining regulatory hurdles? And then how do you accelerate the infrastructure buildup? And I think if we're able to help the EU advance on all of these important workflows, then we'll have done good impact over the year. But again, it's going to be incredibly challenging because the external situation is quite challenging.
I think it's a good point. Also, again, you look at some of the forward pricing into the next, winter. As you say, it's not something which is going to be fixed as soon as we get to the spring, and it's going to be a challenging winter on many levels. Yeah, I guess touching back to the point you made there around things moving quickly. And again, I've got some clients who exactly have had that DOE money coming through or applications relatively straightforwardly because of some of the work that they're doing. Do you recognize or hope to see this year that there will be a speeding of processes within the policymaking environments? And again, when we first spoke, and I think it's a sort of a key theme of one of the big reports from Cleantech for Europe, this kind of European man on the moon moment really is that leap of great potential. But with that, of course, as with the moon landings, you had to break quite a lot of rules and regulations and barriers, real and perceived, in order to get there. How do you see that sort of feeling in Brussels that perhaps we do need to just break a few rules along the way, or change them, obviously, rather than break them, but move things forward in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm completely honest, I think this is going to take a while longer. I mean, again, it's a complete culture change in a way, and it's a mindset change that we need to effect. But that's it's hard to do these in the space of a year, right? So I think what we're seeing is we're starting to see a number of, I would say, clean tech champions in various positions in the EU, a lot of them in funding institutions. So thinking about the EIB, the IF, the EIC, are doing really tremendous work. So I think with those types of institutions, we can really help accelerate some of the processes, bring the best opportunities to them, and really accelerate some of the great financing that's already taking place, and maybe designing some new instruments that help us respond to competitiveness issues. I think on the broader kind of political realm, it moves quite slowly, and in some cases it has a tendency to create a lot of bureaucracy. The problem is the bureaucracy is well intentioned. It's to help prevent things like greenwashing and the money falling into the wrong hands, and these are all important goals. The problem is that the people that can best navigate the bureaucracy are the people that have the resources to do it, and so in a way don't really need extra money. And that's we've come across that in instruments like the Innovation Fund, for instance, which has disproportionately gone to large incumbents, mostly because they can mobilize whole teams to complete applications for months on end, when that's very difficult to do for scale-ups. So again, like these are all things that are being designed with the best intentions, right? And some of these instruments are extremely important, but to change the mindset, it takes a while, and you have to accept also that to take some risks, as you were saying, and to break some eggs, and the Solyndra affair in the US taught us that these types of failures have a big political cost and sometimes can set back the political debate for years on end, right? So you would understand how policymakers could be a bit wary of making those types of leaps. But at the same time, if we don't take these leaps now, it's going to be very hard to recover in a few years.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I get your point. Absolutely, it is challenging to make those risks when, as we touched on before, there historically has been a lack of information of what's going on, and clearly you're bridging a gap to some extent. The other thing, again, that's challenging from a policy perspective, again, is sort of the theme of elections and changing government priorities and parties having different priorities. And what's the situation in Brussels with elections? Or European elections, which could impact positively or negatively on the year ahead?
Right. So for everyone's context, there will be elections and changes in administrations in 2024, which means the second half of 2023 is going to be about programs and campaigning, et cetera, et cetera. I'd say, listen, we can't really know what's going to happen. We've seen in Europe how unpredictable elections are. Again, here I would come back to the fact that clean tech does not achieve just one thing, right? It achieves decarbonization, but it also achieves industrial leadership and energy security. And that characteristic of clean technologies is helping us position this as a non-partisan issue, right? We can speak to the Greens about decarbonization benefits of clean technologies. We can speak to conservatives about industrial leadership and jobs. And we can speak to everyone about energy security, right? And so it's extremely important not to think of this as, okay, we should support socialists so that they enact a green agenda, which is, if that's your belief, then great. But our focus will be on building support from all sides of the political spectrum. One, because that's how you get to real change, but also because it's true. Like if you are a conservative and you worry about business and competitiveness, cleantech is a real response to that. We're not making it up, right? It is the key to your future competitiveness. So we have to rest on the fact that clean technologies are the future and bring so many of these benefits to make this a non-partisan but generational issue.
And I think it's always been an easier era when you can talk about things like job creation, like economic growth, like GDP, like security, and then if you happen to not believe in climate change, then there's still a case for moving into clean tech, right, or for supporting it. So it's those things I think are as important, if not more so, than the decarbonization aspect.
And same for energy security. I mean, right now, if you live in Eastern Europe, in Czechia, for instance, and your bills have gone up, 10 times, then you're very happy that Invent Capital has invested in Voltaire, and that Voltaire is there to install solar panels on your roof or a heat pump, because that's actually going to decrease your energy bills, right? So we also have to take that into account now, that we're actually a sector that helps people lower their bills, and again, that's something that speaks to all political sides. Everyone wants to help households right now. So how do we make sure that they do that, not by building too many LNG terminals to import gas from Uzbekistan, but instead really focus on the next generation of technologies that can already deliver great stuff for Europe. If you look at advanced geothermal, for instance, that could provide base load power to pretty much everyone in Europe. So again, how do you scale companies like GA Drilling in Slovakia that Cleantech invested into? So it's just about showing the clear value propositions of some of these technologies, and then making sure that they connect to the political goals of energy security, industrial leadership, and decarbonization for some.
Yeah. How would you deal with the challenge? Because again, this week there was some brilliant, potential brilliant news from Fusion with events this week of getting to a point where obviously energy out was higher than energy in. Long way to go there, of course, but potentially game-changing technology. There's a lot of noise and froth around green hydrogen, which again has absolutely huge potential, but equally has a lot of players who are embellishing, shall we say, at best, some of the use cases and benefits of that. So how do you as an organization, because again, you're, if anything, the translator to policymakers, how do you deal with the breadth of technologies that are at play, and the challenges of where do you focus your time as an organization? Because that in itself is almost like, how do you eat an elephant? It's kind of so big and so vast. Where do you start for you personally and for your organization? How do you deal with, and how do you start to work out which bits are we focusing on this year, and what can we achieve realistically in the course of a year, for example?
Well, I mean, first I'll say we're certainly not alone in what we do, right? And I'll mention a few other organizations that are working in specific sectors, because we would never have the bandwidth to do that in every sector, right? So I'm thinking of the Renewable Hydrogen Coalition, for instance, in hydrogen. I'm thinking about, negative emissions platform, for instance, for carbon removal, and many, many others. I guess what I'm trying to say is Cleantech for Europe is not going to bring the solution to every sector. There are sectoral organizations in Brussels and in member states that are doing that very well. Your question is fair, though. How do we bring to policymakers some of the most interesting and important technologies? I think again it has to come from what is it that the policymaker or politician is trying to achieve. Right? If we're talking about energy security, we're going to bring, depending on the country we're talking about, we're going to bring a very different set of solutions than if we're talking pure decarbonization. Right? So it's really about contextualizing those things. We honestly started from a list of areas where we felt there was the potential for impact and a kind of European right to win in a way. So if you look at renewable hydrogen, for instance, we have some of the top players in electrolyzer technology in Europe. So why wouldn't we be the global leaders in renewable hydrogen, right? And then once you've identified that, well, then you have to build a whole value chain and the whole support system to make that happen, right? Same for green steel. We have the availability of renewables, of hydrogen, and of technology to make it happen. So why wouldn't Iberia, or why wouldn't Sweden become a leader in green steel? So we've really tried to identify, okay, where are some areas where the EU can really win, and we'll make those top priorities. And then we obviously have a second tier that may be a bit more early stage. So I was mentioning geothermal, for instance. There's some late stage geothermal that's happening, which is really great. But for the more advanced kind of deep drilling stuff, we know it's a few years out. So we're going to place it in context where we know it can wait for 5 years before a big deployment. Right. So it's also it's right to win for the EU, but it's also temporal, right? You have to bring the solution, because if someone asks you to solve a problem for the next winter and you bring them a solution that will only be ready in 5 or 10 years, you've kind of missed the point. Which is the same for fusion. I mean, excellent news from the US. There was excellent news from France as well a few months ago. But again, like, how do you place that in a temporal context where you're not misleading policymakers about what it could achieve? Because if they don't get prepared for what's happening in the meantime, then again, you've kind of provided the wrong advice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we are by definition within the cleantech sector optimists. That being said, what do you see with your optimistic, realistic head for 2023 as being some of the key things, if we're talking again this time next year, that you would have hopefully we would have seen in Europe in the year to come? Yeah.
So this is my wish list, right? My wish list would honestly it would start with on the financing front. I do think we need to match the hundreds of billions of dollars that are going to be made available in the US. But again, I'm almost less worried about the amount and more worried about how easy it is for clean tech companies to tap into these amounts. If we make hundreds of billions of euros available, but only make them available to incumbents, we're going to, make huge bets in CCUS and not much else. So how do we make this money available to clean tech startups and scale-ups is really important. That would be my kind of wish number one. For the rest, I guess, if we manage to shift the debate about energy security to a full debate about clean tech, I think that'll be a big win as well. If the EU understand that its future, its independent future is with renewables and clean technologies, and not with LNG. Again, it'll be a big win. And I'm not saying let's not get prepared for next winter, right? I'm saying there's a real possibility that if you deploy some technologies fast enough, that 2-3 winters down the line, you're not going to need that stopgap anymore. And so, how do we get in the position to do that? That'd be my wish number two. And then wish number three is how can we make this a whole of Europe opportunity? Again, we started initiatives in the Nordics, in the Baltics, in France, in Germany. We'd really love to start an initiative in Iberia, in Central and Eastern Europe. How do we make sure that every European country is positioning itself to be a leader in the new economy is extremely important for us. I think we will have failed if we make this only an opportunity for Germany, Sweden, and France. And so that's a really important part of our mission as well, is how do we make sure innovators and investors in some of these other countries are also scaling up and reaping the benefits for their local markets.
Yeah, reaping those benefits, as you say. Well, brilliant. Listen, it's great to have a catch up and hear your thoughts for the year gone and the aspirations for the year ahead. For the audience, where can they go to find out some more about your work and find out more about the landscape within the European clean tech sector?
Sure. So they can go to cleantechforeurope.com and find all of our publications, which range from the research type to really the political recommendations type. So have a look, send us your feedback. Always really interesting to have the input from the full community and not just the coalitions that we host. If you want to engage further, we have an event coming up in Brussels on January 25th, which is going to be a relatively small affair, but a high-level gathering of all of our coalitions and policymakers that are involved in the good work. If you want to join that, there's a link to requesting an invite. Again, it's going to be a relatively small event, so can't guarantee a seat to everyone. But please flag if you're interested. And beyond that, I'm sure I'll have the pleasure of seeing your listeners, at all clean tech events across Europe in the next few months.
Yeah, looking forward to many of them. Thanks again for sharing, Jules. So we'll make sure on the episode pages, we'll post links to all of the various sites where you can find out a bit more about Jules and the work that the Cleantech for Europe organization are doing. It's been a great and exciting year for cleantech globally, particularly in Europe, as we've just heard. So thanks very much for all of those who are active in the sector and for those who listen to the podcast. and now watch the podcast. If you do, then please do make sure that you subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice, or subscribe on the new YouTube channel, so you make sure in the new year you keep abreast of what's going on. We've got lots of guests already lined up for January, February, and as Jules said, there's a lot of events in the sector coming up in the first quarter of next year, and we'll try and be party to those as well. Jules, thanks very much for joining us. Great to have the update. Have a great Christmas. It's going to be a busy year ahead, I'm quite sure. Likewise to our listeners, enjoy the festive period, and lots of work for us all to do in 2023, but again, lots of really exciting opportunities for us all. So thanks for joining us, and thanks, Jules.
Thank you, and good luck to everyone in 2023. We need you all to succeed.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, David.